On 9/11/2001, I was working at O'Neill and Associates. It's actually in the other office that we had, which was a high-rise building on the 16th floor.
I remember vividly where I was. It was at my office at 1 Beacon Street. It was around, it was just before 9 or just after 9.
So I was actually in my second day of high school. I went to high school in Jersey City, which is right across the river from the Twin Towers, from Manhattan.
And I was about a mile from the Pentagon when I saw a dust cloud come up in that direction, just over the hill. At first it was a brown dust cloud, and then it turned into a black churning smoke. And from my experience in working with the Boeing Company and also in living in Wichita, Kansas, where they do fire drills on crashed airplanes because of the aircraft manufacturing Air Force Base, I could tell that it was jet fuel that was burning.
I was preparing for a meeting with a couple of colleagues of mine, Pat Kennedy and Bo Holland. We happened to be in the conference room, and there was a television on because we were going through our papers, and the TV just happened to be on the background. All of a sudden we saw, oh my goodness, look at what's happening in New York. The first planes hit the buildings, and we stopped what we were doing because we were preparing to leave in like 5 minutes for this meeting outside the office. We stopped what we were doing, we called everybody in the office, we said, oh my goodness, look what's happening.
And Bo Holland, who was working with us then, came in and said, you have to come in and watch what just happened on TV. And he had the Today Show on, and it showed the second plane going into the building in New York. And you know, he just had a gaping mouth when I walked in to the conference room where the television was. And we just sat there, and I don't think anybody moved. I don't think he or I moved for, God, maybe 20 minutes to a half hour. We were just spellbound by the horror.
And all of a sudden we brought people in to watch, and that's when we actually saw live the plane go into the second World Trade Center tower.
So all of us, all the students kind of ran outside, and we stood in the street, and we could see across the river, and we could see the smoke pouring out of the buildings. And it was like something out of a movie. It was surreal. And obviously they came down just a few minutes later, and everything went crazy. My folks couldn't come in to get me, and all the trains and subways were shut down, so I couldn't get home.
So it all started to come together that it wasn't just some haphazard accident on September 11th, 2001, but attack by terrorists on some of our most important institutions.
No one knew what was going to happen next. I mean, I remember feeling like just getting through the day was a good thing, because it wasn't clear what was going to happen, if there were going to be nuclear terrorism, if there were going to be other acts of terrorism. So
I was in Toronto, Canada on 9/11, giving a speech at an aviation safety conference. And I was in my room when I saw the first plane hit, and then was there when I saw the second plane hit just after 9 o'clock, and knew immediately that this was some sort of act of terrorism. You know, Canada was just as stunned as the United States was. People were crowded around televisions in the restaurants and bars. Commerce in Toronto really slowed down.
My daughter had just been baptized that weekend. So I was living in Seattle, Washington, and my entire family was in town, all East Coasters in town for the baptism, which was on Sunday. And so on Monday, my brother and sister left and flew back, and actually landed at Newark Tuesday morning. And so Tuesday morning, we obviously we're a different time zone, 3 hours behind. So my brother calls from the East Coast and says, you know, turn on the news. So we we turned on the news immediately and saw the aftermath of the first plane, and basically nonstop watching as the day went on. And my family was stranded there with us a little extra because of that.
So I was a sophomore in high school in Lansdale, Pennsylvania, and it was a pretty strange day. I remember most distinctly one of the department chairs walking into the classroom that I was in and whispering something to the teacher. And then the next period, somebody said, well, it appears there's been an attack in New York City.
I was in algebra class my freshman year of college, and the teacher came in, made a brief announcement, and then started class. And about 10 to 15 minutes later, a larger announcement was made, and classes were dismissed, and everyone was sent home.
I remember very vividly, I was in 5th grade in homeroom, and I actually didn't hear the news in school, but I remember heading to carpool, and at the time my mother and my grandmother had both come to pick me up from school, which I knew was unusual. So immediately when I saw them together, I sensed something was wrong.
It was actually my first full week of high school. I was a freshman. I was very nervous about high school, so I just remember being very nervous that morning. And when I heard the news about 9/11, all those nerves kind of went away, and I realized there were a lot bigger problems in the world.
I was in French class, and I remember that one of the professors that I didn't have came to the door yelling, and he said, "Turn on the TV, turn on the TV." And so my French teacher turned it on, and then we all kind of just watched, and we stayed in school all day, but it didn't even seem real.
I was in the 3rd grade, and I didn't find out until later on in the day because my school didn't want to shut down and create chaos.
And my teacher had us all sit down, and she explained what was going on. And a few of my classmates actually had family who was down in the metro area, and that was pretty impactful because I was only in 4th grade. So it was hard to really understand what was going on, but I knew that it was bad.
So we spent kind of the next few periods in the dark because it was, it was a time when you weren't super connected to a cell phone, to the internet. So, but by about 10:30, 11 o'clock, information started to trickle out. And I remember one of my midday periods, the biology teacher just sat at her desk kind of crying all day and just put the TV on.
And I remember the day. The day was a crystal clear day with perfectly blue skies, and all of a sudden it was overwhelmed by the horror of those planes going into the World Trade Center.
But the thing that was really memorable to me was how quiet everything got, and the memories of September 11th, at least on the East Coast, were the blue skies, the beautiful blue skies. Seattle had blue skies that day as well, so it was kind of eerie in that respect.
Then immediately, well, probably within an hour, our office was closed down because we were in a high-rise, and nobody really knew if that was the end of it. We all left the building. It was eerily quiet. It was unbelievable. You couldn't hear a sound because there were no planes, because they were all grounding. And it was one of the most beautiful days that I've ever seen in September. A sparkling, clear, sunny day. But it was quiet. And then we all went to our respective homes, making sure I had friends and family who lived in New York and worked in New York, just wanting to make sure that they were okay. And then ultimately, as the day grew on, learning about actually a friend of mine who was on the American Airlines flight who lost his life. So it was a traumatic day for everybody.
Obviously, the entire world changed in one day. It still is today the biggest and most impactful day probably in my short lifetime.
I just think, I don't know that I've ever experienced any other time in my lifetime where for just weeks on end people were anxious. All you would do is, just check the internet constantly to see if there had been another incident.
And I think it's changed everybody's life, not only in their workplace, but in how they comport themselves daily. Whether it's parents watching more closely over their children, whether it's going down a highway in Arizona with, a shooter where they just are more they know that horror and terror can happen almost anywhere at any time, and I think people are aware of that.